Every day they step into places most people never want to see. Ambulance crews and ER orderlies witness things most of us never hear about. Tonight they share real stories from their shifts. No filter, no script, just the truth. Let's go. This was more frustrating than anything, but we had one patient who had a tendency to chew on and then swallow batteries. Now, a lot of our patient group would repeatedly swallow certain risk items that they weren't supposed to have access to, including tweezers and forks. But this patient was a particular concern, as they'd repeatedly been taken to A&E over the issue. It was found that the leaking battery acid was starting to really fuck up their stomach and could potentially be fatal. So naturally, it became an immediate priority to take additional precaution against it happening again. Fortunately, batteries were extremely difficult to find on the ward, as all remotes and such were locked away. In addition, they only had arm's-length supervised access to items that contained any batteries, which had usually been taped inside regardless. However, the patient in question discovered a trick to get around this. This involved going to the toilet, defecating, sorting through their excrement, plucking out the recycled battery, chewing on it, and then swallowing it again to continue to cycle. Once this started happening, the decision was made to lock their bathroom at all times and supervise them whenever they had to use it. So around that time, I was doing my observations on the ward, which basically involved checking in on all of the patients every 5 minutes to make sure they were still alive. The battery swallower was in their room, just sprawled out on their bed with a sheet over their lower half, and reading a book. When I'd open their door, they'd smile and nod at me before going back to reading. They'd appeared settled in mood throughout the day, so I wasn't particularly concerned about anything. During one later check, I noticed that they had repositioned themselves so that they were now lying on their side instead of their stomach and facing the door. They also looked a little flustered. I asked them if they were okay, and they said they were fine. I didn't have much of a reason to not trust them. Plus, I had to check everyone else, so I just took their word for it and moved on. As it neared the end of my hour of doing observations, I opened their door and immediately recoiled from the stench. It was atrocious, like someone had bombed an open sewer with mustard gas. The patient was still sat on their bed, but now they were quite red in the face and smiling at me with their eyes opened wide. Naturally, I immediately asked them, "What in the name of fuck is that smell?" in more professional wording. They tried to respond to me, but their voice came out muffled and incomprehensible, and as I stood there staring at them, I realized that their mouth was full and they were trying to swallow something. It was too late to do anything at that point, but it dawned on me that ever since they had moved onto their side on the bed, they'd been trying to shit onto their hand so that they could swallow the battery. It had obviously taken a while to push it out there, and we later found out that they'd just plucked the entire turd out of themselves and stuffed it into their mouth. The worst bit was speaking to them afterwards and having to take in their breath and seeing their teeth. Fucking awful. Oh, and the battery wasn't even in there, so they'd essentially eaten their own shit for nothing. I worked security for hospitals for about 4 years, half of that in a mental hospital. I have enough stories to fill a book, and I'll probably get around to actually doing it one day. But these are some of the more memorable moments. On a high-security unit for NCR, not criminally responsible, people too mentally ill to be put in prison essentially, people doing a patrol. I'm trying to chat up this cute nurse when a patient comes over to the window and asks for a crayon. She gives it to him. Later as I'm leaving, I figure I'll score some brownie points with nurse by getting it back. So I go over to the patient, who at this point is just standing around just looking at a wall because reasons, and I ask him for the crayon. He proceeds to reach behind himself, into his pants, and dig into his asshole, and proudly presents to me his shit-covered fist and the once blue, now brown crayon. I tell him he can give the crayon back himself. Aforementioned nurse was not pleased. Sometimes the NCR patients got privileges to go outside for 10-15 minutes with supervision. When they did come back, we would scan them with metal detectors and search their things. One woman who was there for stealing babies, yes, that is what you just read, would walk around with literally dozens of tampons and maxi pads in her coat. Another guy would hoard butter packets. According to him, butter was the best lube. One of the friendly guys in long term would always stop to chat with me whenever he saw me, and he'd launch into complete nonsense like, "Man, this tree had the best microwave when Popeye looked like Karl Marx in the circus with an acrobat. But that guy ain't shit with the president and kale." And he'd be saying this stuff in a smooth, conversational tone, never skipped a beat, as if everything he was saying made sense. All I could do in response was offer a fist bump and tell him to have a good one. Having a conversation with a woman for 2 hours while waiting for a doctor about what the Bible says about the devil, trying to convince her he has no power over her because he was telling her to stab me with a pen. Thankfully, I was a good conversationalist, apparently, because no stabbing ensued. We got into some deep philosophical shit about the nature of good and evil framed in mankind's freedom of will. Not me, but one of my supervisors walked into the chapel area to find a couple having sex. The guy has this girl bent over the pulpit or whatever that front speaking thing is called, just banging her doggy style. My supervisor stops and tries to tell them to stop, but the guy just stares him down, looking him right in the eye as he continues, finishes, and pushes the girl aside, no break in eye contact. He comes around from the pulpit, stark naked, and says, "Done, boss, you can take me back." Later, my supervisor said, I felt like I'd been eye-fucked on a whole other level. We had a guy on a particular unit for the most mentally disabled people you can imagine. While this guy was super nice to everyone, 2 things kept him out of living on the outside. 1, he loved to paint with his own feces, and 2, he loved to share his art. So, one week, M, we'll call him, is having some constipation. Now, one of the new nurses, unknowing of M's artistic yearnings, decided to give him some laxatives. This makes M's tummy upset, and he starts screaming at people, so they put him into an isolation room to cool off. We get a call a few hours later. M has painted his room. Oh God, did he ever. We couldn't even see into the room because the window was covered in feces. We got into literal biohazard suits and charged in and wrestled with a shit-covered man for 30 minutes as the nurses stood by gagging and trying to figure out how to navigate the logistics of cleaning everything. The room was completely bathed in shit. The walls, the floor, the mattress, even parts of the ceiling. M himself was completely covered, head to toe. I had no idea a human being could actually store that much shit inside their body until I met my ex. Hey, ooh. But for all the funny and weird moments like above, there was heinous shit that'll haunt me forever. The kinds of stories I don't like telling because they bomb at parties and drudge up a lot of personal bad juju. People just screaming for hours, a kid hacking their forearms apart with scissors, people going off their rockers and acting like they're possessed by demons, having to strip people so they can't hang themselves in isolation, nurses abusing their power against patients they didn't like. It was a fun and interesting job for the most part, though, and I miss it sometimes. One of my most memorable incidents as a med student was when I had to follow the treatment of an inpatient for a couple of weeks. I was assigned this 23-year-old Polynesian girl that had schizophrenia. She had religious delusions and was convinced she was the second coming of Jesus. Fascinating character, and she was really well read when it came to theology. 1 week into my clerking of her, another inpatient came in. He was a 40-year-old Aboriginal man that also thought he was the second coming of Jesus. Initially, these two Jesus had open confrontations and verbal arguments over theology and who was the legitimate Jesus. Both thought the other was clearly a fraud and mental, but neither possessed the insight to recognize that they themselves might be deluded. After an initial week of drama, the fight settled down. The next week, during their outside leave time, both were found having sex in the bushes outside the hospital, surrounded by weed and meth. Turns out they had reconciled their differences. They realized that both were carriers of the Spirit of Jesus and were going to give birth to the actual Jesus. Over the coming few months, I kept an eye on my patients' records. They got busted having sex a couple more times until the suitable outpatient setting was found for the man. The girl did end up getting pregnant, and I assumed she did have the baby. I didn't check to see whether she did give birth to Jesus. I don't work in a mental hospital, but I've seen plenty on the mental health ward at the prison I work in. I'm not sure why all of the best stories involve shit, but they do. Anyway, I had just started as a fairly new nurse and was completely new to corrections when I came in short one night to an awful stench in the foyer of our infirmary. When you enter into the infirmary, the officer's station is behind glass to your right, and on the back wall is a window that looks in on our mental health observation cell. On this day, we had a fellow that was 1 or 2 cards shy of a full deck. He had some serious issues, to say the least. He was also one that liked to play with his shit if he got angry. He'd literally use it as Play-Doh and smear it all over the cell. This particular day, a group of the nurses on the shift before mine denied a request of his due to his behavior, so, of course, he starts smearing shit everywhere. So, shortly after he started doing that, change of shift happens, and I come on to relieve those nurses that pissed him off. As I enter to make my rounds, I notice names of the previous shift's nurses written on the wall on his shit. While asking how he was doing and if he felt okay, I asked what all the names on the wall were for and received an answer I didn't expect at the time. He looked me straight in the eye and, as serious as possible, said, "It's my shit list, and you don't want to be on it, do you?" I am usually great at maintaining my composure, but his demeanor and the seriousness in which he said it, I lost it and had to walk off the ward's hall. Needless to say, I made the shit list later on. In no way am I making fun of his condition. It's a very serious diagnosis, but sometimes, if you can make light of it, you have to for your own sanity. I'll start with an apology for my poor storytelling. I just read this over before posting, and it's nowhere near as interesting and/or funny as it has been when I've told it in person. I worked as a registered mental nurse, RMN, in the UK for over 20 years before giving it up for the sake of my own sanity. There was a time when there were 3 Jesuses on the ward. Contrary to popular conception, the number of psychiatric patients who have delusions of being Jesus is fairly small. This might be a cultural thing, though. Maybe in the Bible Belt of the USA, it is more common. I was only in the PICU, Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit, what used to be called the locked ward, to let the staff there attend a meeting. I worked in a secure unit for mentally disordered offenders, and several of us had come across to provide relief cover. The incident started between 2 men in their 20s, each arguing that the other couldn't be Jesus because he was. This went on for 5 to 10 minutes, with the arguments ranging from the deeply philosophical to puerile insults. I don't remember the actual words, as this was way back in 1989. As none of us really knew either patient, and there was no obvious sign that the argument would escalate, we were just keeping an eye on the 2 guys as well as everyone else. All was quietish until the 3rd Jesus arrived. The 2 original guys lost the plot when the 3rd Jesus started insisting that they were the real deal. The first 2 were prepared to accept that it was possible for Jesus to be 2 people at the same time, that he could do so in the one place without being aware of himself, that he, both of him, could be detained against his will by these lowly humans and all the other apparent contradictions. I'm fairly sure they could have accepted the existence of the 3rd incarnation of the Messiah too, if not for one factor. God might well have chosen to become flesh in West London in the late 1980s. Twice, in the same ward of the local psychiatric hospital at the same time, subjecting himself to the control of mere mortals such as I. He moves in mysterious ways after all, his wonders to perform. All that was fair enough. What wasn't apparently possible, though, was that he would choose to do so as a she. "Can't be Jesus. You're a woman," said Jesus 1. "I'm the Son of God. I can be whatever I want to be," said Jesus 3. And this was when things got out of hand. Tables overturned, cups, ashtrays, and chairs sent flying, and some of the most ungodly language I ever heard. Luckily, the regular ward staff came back into the building just as it all kicked off, and we were able to go back to our own unit. Unlucky also, though, as I'd like to have seen how it all panned out. An old family friend told us a story about an incident that took place with her when she was working as a psychiatrist in a nut house. She was a rather small and skinny woman, 160 centimeters or so. Anyhow, a patient came to her office, a big, strong man, and closed the door, opened his suitcase, and said, "Now we are going to operate you." Now remember, this was about 3 to 4 decades ago, and there were no security measures in loony offices. Nonetheless, this took place in Soviet times. So, the guy opens his suitcase, which is full of knives and scalpels and such. He's blocking the way, and there's no option of her escaping. She asks the patient, "But with which colored thread are we going to sew me together?" Patient, "Oh yeah, hadn't thought about that. I'll find some." He ran out the door. and so did she, escaping. It's weird how a person's brain works in such situations.